This video is brought to you by BetterHelp. Hey, heads up, God is dead. No, I'm not just quoting my favorite evangelical film.
God is dead.
I'm parodying one of our favorite non-evangelical philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, who dropped this legendary line in 1822, and in the process changed the course of contemporary philosophy. But much like Kevin Sorbo's Oscar-unworthy performance, these three words have gone on to fuel all sorts of writers, artists, and intellectuals who had such a bummer time at church growing up that they spent their adult lives militantly fighting religion. So are today's atheists carrying the spirit of Nietzsche into the 21st century? And if old Friedrich were alive today, would he be making dank memes about how church is for normies? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint the edgelords out there, but we think that Nietzsche's God is Dead is not just a critique of Christianity, but also a critique of atheism. So let's figure out what would happen if Nietzsche logged on to Reddit's atheist community in today's video on the death of God. Did we miss the point? Okay guys, before we keep going, I want to take a second and thank this video sponsor, BetterHelp. Now, if you've ever experienced anxiety, depression, or just kind of felt overwhelmed lately, BetterHelp is a resource that can help you feel better. And for any of you who, have ever tuned into our live stream, you know that I have kind of openly struggled with depression and ADHD, and I've talked about how therapy has been a really big help for me. I honestly don't know if I'd be where I was in my life right now without having a great therapist. And BetterHelp's network of more than 30,000 therapists are ready to listen to and help you. After taking a brief questionnaire, you'll be matched with a therapist whose expertise fits your unique needs. And thanks to BetterHelp's remote model, you can work with a therapist whose skills might not be otherwise available in your area. Now, you can message your therapist at any time, and you'll receive timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule your choice of phone or video sessions to receive counseling in real time. And in the event that you and your therapist aren't a perfect match, you can easily switch to a new one for no additional charge. So, join the more than 2 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/wisecrack. Or you can just click the link in the video description. When you do, you'll get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/wisecrack. Now, let's get back to the show. Okay, so if you saw our recent video on nihilism, you maybe heard me use a term that I stole from one of my old professors, angry 17-year-old atheism. Now this refers to the type of resentment-fueled anti-God vibes that you might observe amongst sartorially gothic teens hanging out at suburban American malls. Now you can imagine these folks scrawling "God is dead" on the covers of their textbooks, or carrying around a paperback copy of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra that they probably haven't actually read. And while Nietzsche was surely being critical of the religious proclivities of his day when he penned his famous mantra, our 17-year-old brains often miss the subtlety of what he's really saying. So if Nietzsche's most infamous three words don't literally translate to "God is dead," "be an atheist," "only idiots believe in magical sky daddies," and "big boys use reason and not belief," well then what do they mean? To understand that, we need to consider both the text in which he uses the phrase and the philosophical and intellectual climate in which he was writing. To offer an almost offensively quick TLDR of philosophy, since the medieval era, almost all Western philosophy had some type of formal relationship with religion. Now, for some people like Descartes, it was pretty literal, because he argued that the existence of God is what ensures the consistency of rationality. Now, for others, it was the basis for their non-religious moral philosophy. We see this with Kant's categorical imperative, which is basically love your neighbor as yourself, except we do it because of rational principles and not divine commands. Now, when the Enlightenment came around, God was replaced by human reason as the ultimate source of truth and meaning. But even so, Western philosophy still felt pretty, like Christian-y. It remained indebted to the structures of Christian thinking for a while, even if the philosophies themselves were often overtly atheistic. Okay, think of it this way. Contemporary pop music in many ways might seem like it's just done away with the cheesy structures used by an old band like the Beatles. But in actuality, these bands are using the exact same chord structures and scales and rhythms and instruments to make music. The structure is still there, whether or not you want to say that John or Paul is dead. Okay, so enter Nietzsche's God is Dead from his book, The Gay Science. In the opening aphorism of Book 3, New Battles, he writes, "After Buddha was dead, they still showed his shadow in a cave for centuries. A tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead. But given the way people are, there may still for millennia be caves in which they show his shadow. And we must still defeat his shadow as well. In other words, even after God was dead, the shadow or influence of God remained. And people didn't really distinguish between the shadow and the deity itself. In other words, if God was the sun, we had at best a UV-resistant umbrella to hide under and try to avoid a sunburn. Now, this phrase comes back later in Book 3, in an aphorism called the madman. Now, Nietzsche tells the story of a madman who runs around the marketplace with a lantern, crying incessantly, "I'm looking for God! I'm looking for God!" Immediately, the madman is mocked. Now, since many of those who did not believe in God were standing around together just then, he caused great laughter. The madman replies to this mockery by saying, "Where is God? I'll tell you. We have killed him. You and I. We are all his murderers." Now, note that he says that many of those who did not believe in God were standing together just then, meaning that this madman wasn't talking to, religious yokels, but that he was in a context where there was other atheists and it was normal to not believe in God. So the problem here for the madman is that no one else really realizes the magnitude of the death of God. And this echoes the passage we already read from New Battles in which God is dead, but we still need to defeat his shadow. Again, the important thing here is that Nietzsche isn't just saying, God is dead, religious folks are dummies, I'm the #1 atheist boy. He's saying that those celebrating the death of God without adequately reckoning with the shadow are missing the point. I'll give you another example. It reminds me of a thing they used to talk about when I went to Christian youth group in high school, which was the God-shaped hole in all our hearts. Now, when youth pastors used this, they were talking about how if you're having sex or doing drugs or listening to the Wu-Tang Clan, you're just filling a hole that should be filled by God. There's a God-shaped hole in all of us. Now, Nietzsche worries that folks are celebrating the death of God without realizing that new beliefs and systems are just unconsciously filling that same hole. In other words, Nietzsche wants to destroy your hole.
That's any religion. That is 3/4 of your religion, is you got to use your holes the right way.
Now, in his telling, the madman goes on to ask, but how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? How can we console ourselves? The murderers of all murderers. The holiest and mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? There is never a greater deed. And whoever is born after us will on account of this deed belong to a higher history than all history up to now. But the people in the marketplace just looked at him in silence.
My farts don't sound anything like that. My farts are long and way louder, and they reek.
He then says, I come too early, throws his lantern on the ground so it smashes, and says, my time is not yet. This deed is still more remote to them than the remotest stars, and yet they have done it themselves. Now, it sounds a little dramatic, and it is, but the idea is that people don't even realize what they've done by killing God. And almost as an afterthought, the aphorism adds that later that day, the madman forced himself into several churches, attempted to sing a funeral rite for God, and then, when let out, replied, what then are these churches now if not the tombs of God? Okay, but let's really reflect on the madman passage, which is distinct from the madmen passage, and that's where Donald Draper convinces a board full of McDonald's executives that the Big Mac will become a new god to a spiritually empty and hungry American consumer. Now here it seems that Nietzsche isn't targeting, like religious idiots, but rather he's targeting people who already identified as atheists. Of course, it could also be said that many religious folks are also in denial about the death of God, which is especially ironic to Nietzsche because the death of God is, in a way, Christianity's literal truth. For those of you who are not familiar with Christian theology, the whole deal is that Jesus, who is also God, dies on the cross and is then resurrected, making the death of God the main event. While the Christians missing the point about the death of God have hands as clean as those of Pontius Pilate, the atheists are even more complicit. Because they think God never existed in the first place, they're unable to come to terms with the magnitude of his death. Put differently, they've never acknowledged the massive influence that God has had on human thought and existence, and as such aren't able to reckon with the lack of this existential nucleus. It's kind of like how even though Santa isn't real, sorry kids, he has a real effect on Christmas present shopping and fuels a massive portion of the economy each year. Now, we see this throughout Book 3 of the Gay Science, where Nietzsche goes pretty hard when critiquing Christian morality. And I think you've probably heard a lot of this stuff before. I talked about it in the video on nihilism that we made earlier this year. Check it out if you haven't. In this critique, Nietzsche points out that Christian morality focuses meaning on heaven and the afterlife so much that people sort of neglect and reject earth and this life, which leads to a kind of nihilism because they're denying their very existence. But Nietzsche goes equally hard at those who place all their belief in things like natural science. Now, in his aphorism, Let Us Beware, Nietzsche warns against thinking of the universe as either an organism or a machine, as can be common in natural science. He points out that trying to discover scientific laws is actually a way of deifying nature, i.e., turning nature into our new God. He writes, "Let us beware of saying that there are laws in nature. There are only necessities. There is no one who commands, no one who obeys, no one who transgresses." He's noting the tendency we have to take the structural aspects of theological thinking, i.e., there is a design to all of reality that follows a consistent and well-formed set of principles, and then apply this to the non-human world. In another aphorism, Cause and Effect, he questions whether natural science has genuinely advanced human knowledge, writing, "We call it explanation, but description is what distinguishes us from older stages of knowledge and science. We are better at describing. We explain just as little as our predecessors. The specifically qualitative aspect, for example, of every chemical process still appears to be a miracle, as does every locomotion. No one has explained the push." He's saying that sure, we've gotten a lot better at describing what's going on around us with more detail and specificity, but we haven't gotten that much closer to understanding why or how any of it is actually going down. It's kind of like every time we discover a new star or supernova, we don't get any closer to figuring out why the hell we're here in the first place. We're just able to describe the cosmos with more detail. While natural science helped draw an end to a theocentric conception of the universe where everything revolves around God, it then required its partisans to take on just as much faith in something else as they once had in God. But what about those of you who might be thinking to yourself, "But Michael, I'm not like other atheists. I'm one of the super smart ones who can see precisely why religion can be so evil and irrational. What would Nietzsche think about me?" Well, he might think that you have one thing absolutely right, but potentially some other stuff absolutely wrong. Now, he'd say you're correct in so much as religion, as a moral system, can be an antiquated set of beliefs, that it best makes one indifferent to worldly suffering and focused solely on heaven, and at worst, can fuel tribalism, hatred, and war. But Nietzsche brings up this aspect of his Death of God material alongside what can be read as a critique of the type of scientism associated with new atheist thinkers like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. New atheists often compare the idea of God to a flying spaghetti monster, i.e. a dumb and made-up deity, for the purpose of saying both ideas are equally as stupid. But this fails to take seriously the entire legacy of Christian thought in the West, for which God very much did exist. Now, to use a contemporary analogy, even if Q doesn't actually exist, to understand the effects of QAnon on weird aunts and uncles around the world, and then to stem its negative influence, we gotta take the idea of Q seriously. In other words, to acknowledge that in some way, Q does have existential effects because enough people believe in it. In a contemporary context, we're able to understand reality and morality without a reference to the divine. But in refusing to take seriously the legacy of theocentric thought, we are setting ourselves up to repeat it. Now, to get back to our Q comparison, if we were just to say that Q is for paranoid idiots, so we don't need to understand it, we're risking creating a world where conspiracy can just run rampant with very dark and real effects. Now, this is what Nietzsche's getting at when he's critiquing atheism, as by not fully reckoning with the legacy of God, new ideas and systems will simply replace the position once held by God. Science becomes God. The media becomes God. Capital becomes God. Political ideology becomes God. The YouTube algorithm becomes God. So while Nietzsche uses the death of God as a critique of religion, it also serves as a critique against the scientism associated with contemporary atheism. Now, this scientism, according to Massimo Pigliucci, is defined as a totalizing attitude that regards science as the ultimate standard and arbiter of all interesting questions, or alternatively, that seeks to expand the very definition and scope of science to encompass all aspects of human knowledge and understanding. And following Nietzsche's critique, this scientism often equates to filling the mold left by Christianity with scientific beliefs. So rather than asking us to be anti-God or anti-science, Nietzsche is challenging us to respond to the death of God. Perhaps, by putting a posse together, waiting outside the bar where we know God likes to go get sloshed on Thursdays, and then following him home, and when the moment strikes, we just beat him to death with golf clubs. In other words, we gotta complete the act of killing him. Now, what this might look like in practice isn't completely clear, but it's at the heart of Nietzsche's broader philosophical project. Things like master morality dominating slave morality, and the idea of the Übermensch both describe individuals strong enough to respond to the death of God, not by replacing God with something else, looking for another set of transcendent values like God or nature, but by creating new values for ourselves. And this is why Nietzsche is far from an angry 17-year-old atheist. And in fact, he's on the side of life and affirmation. Rather than negating human life through saying stuff like either, actually, heaven is all that really matters, or actually, science explains our whole existence. The death of God means doing away with divine shadows and affirming our own humanity in all of its immediacies. And maybe this is why the new atheists don't feel that new anymore. And why, when a comedian like Ricky Gervais does a bit about why God is dead or dumb, it's most likely just to engender bored yawns. Now, oddly enough, yesterday's Richard Dawkins is today's Jordan Peterson, a figure who is precisely rejecting elements of science for a renewal of a very specific reading of traditional Christianity. And whereas the atheism of the new atheists often became an excuse for Islamophobia amongst folks like Bill Maher, the theism of someone like Peterson serves as an excuse for homophobia, transphobia, racism, and also more Islamophobia. Now, surely this trend will wane. And in a few years, there will be another return of a science-focused atheism that continues to ignore the critiques leveled by Nietzsche in the 19th century. And as such, we see both sides of the coin that Nietzsche was worried about in the wake of the death of God. On one side, we have those unaware of how a lack of engagement with religion leads right into a theologically infused scientism. On the other, those unaware of the death of God who use religious ideas as a way to negate humanity. Now, in both cases, these figures are pointing outside of human existence to God or science to justify a negation of life and our own humanity. And against both of these positions, Nietzsche is asking us to let God die, to finish with his funeral procession, and to think creatively and affirmatively about building new values. And if more folks got this, maybe Nietzsche would be associated more with joyful affirmation than he is with scowling negation. And maybe more young people earnestly searching for meaning would embrace their ability to construct ways of life that are totally indifferent towards God's past, present, or future. But what do you guys think? Have we yet to deal with the full implications of the death of God? Has this led us to turn a bunch of other stuff into gods of various shapes and sizes? And are we even capable of imagining what value and meaning look like outside of a religious framework? Let us know in the comments. Before you go, I wanted to tell you about something. It's called Wisecrack Live. It's our stream. We do it Wednesdays right here on this channel from this room, 10 a.m. Pacific. You should check it out. We have a really good chat. Talk about a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the channel, but it's off the cuff. It's free. It's engaging with the chat. It's a parasocial heaven. It's one of those topics where I don't think I want to try to work it out in real time in front of you all, because I don't want to get in trouble. So come on down. And speaking of parasocial heaven, thank you so much to all of our patrons who support our channel. In return, we give them some extra goodies. I think it's worth it. But if you're interested, there's a link in the description. It means a lot. But thanks to all of you for just being here, for watching, for liking, subscribing, for doing all of those things that make the God of the YouTube algorithm happy so that I can keep paying rent. Until next time, God bless, and I'll see you later.